So my name is Natalie Gibb, and I am owner of Under the Jungle, which is a cave diving center in Mexico. I'm a cave explorer, and I'm a member of the Women Divers Hall of Fame. And today I'm going to be talking to you about exploring some really unusual caves. So let's get started. There you go. I couldn't believe my eyes. All around me, the ceiling and walls of the cave shifted and slid. Huge flakes of gelatinous goo fell from the ceiling and were absorbed into the floor. Ahead of me, I could see long, thin stalactites hanging from the ceiling, but they wiggled in the gentle flow. And the walls and ceiling were also covered with these strange, web-like reticulated growths like this. I reached out my hand to touch a flake of whatever this was, and it was weightless. It dissolved into a puff of dust in my hands. So what was this place? I had never seen anything like it. That first dive into a new cave in a new place where no one had ever expected there to be cave development started me and my exploration partner, Vincent Rouquette-Cathala, on an exploration journey that has continued to this day. So today, I'm going to show you some of the weirdest and most disgusting caves on the planet. This project, which so far has lasted for 7 years, started with a short scouting trip to the Bay of Chetumal in southern Mexico. There, local fishermen had discovered freshwater outlets in the bay, and Vince and I thought it would be interesting if we could go and see if there was cave there, but we really didn't expect to find anything. But we were wrong. These two tiny holes did indeed have cave, and that little itty bitty red line there represents the cave that we found that day. They were interesting, but they weren't quite disgusting yet, and we unimaginatively named them Sea Caves 1 and Sea Caves 2. The sea caves had sandy floors and sharp, craggly formations, and they were covered with orange sponges and these weird white things. They were also pretty magical, full of ocean life that would shelter in the entrance, like sea hare and conch. And they had strong reversing flow, which we since learned can affect the topography of the cave. On a recent trip to Sea Cave 1, we discovered that the line had been entirely buried in the sediment. The line was covered in sea life-like sponges, and in some places the line had been broken from the flow. And some tunnels had been completely filled in with sand. And we since learned that this is typical of many caves in the region. On the second day of our original scouting trip, we headed further back into the bay, and this is where we discovered our first truly disgusting place. It was hiding on this murky hole on the edge of the mangrove forest, and I named the place Pandora. Knowing that there is cave in Pandora makes the whole place look magical, but what would you have thought if you were doing the first dive into this place? Our first concern was the microbes. We didn't know if they were toxic, and we had cuts in our hands, so we were worried about bacterial infections. So after the dive, we aggressively sanitized ourselves and our gear, but it turns out that they were not toxic. In fact, the name of the cave comes from the microbial growth. I named the cave Pandora after the planet in the movie Avatar, because just like that planet, it is filled with strange life. Creepy, disgusting, gooey life. A second, nearly intolerable fact of diving in Pandora was the water itself. It stank like some combination of rotten eggs and death. And in combination with this weird green color, this indicated that Pandora was full of hydrogen sulfide, which is a toxic gas dissolved in water. Hydrogen sulfide not only makes the water smell bad, it turns it acidic. So the water was burning the cuts on my hands, and it made my lips feel numb. As well, hydrogen sulfide can make the water foggy, much foggier than you can see in these edited videos. So it's sometimes hard to know where to go. And finally, the water in Pandora was warm. It was uncomfortably warm, about 30 degrees Celsius. So it felt like we were diving in microbial soup, which I guess we were. The hydrogen and sulfide in Pandora did bring up some safety concerns because as the dives got longer, it felt like we were starting to absorb it. After dives of 5 to 6 hours, we would finish with headaches and nausea, and we would stink of rotten eggs. And so for these reasons, we started diving dry suits in 30 degrees Celsius water and taking breaks after 2 to 3 days of exploration to try to get it out of our systems. The microbes themselves made tying off the cave line difficult because we couldn't tell what was solid and what wasn't. So sometimes we would swim up to a solid appearing tie-off point and the whole thing would just poof into a bit of dust in our hands. And the rock making up the walls of Pandora was also problematic. It was very hard and very sharp. And so we think that the acidic water of Pandora is eating away at the rock and sharpening it. So we can't pull our exploration line as tight as we normally would because we're afraid that the line is going to get cut. And similarly, the rock is very brittle. So sometimes if we pull the line too hard, the rock will just shear off and plunk into the sediment, and then it gets buried, and we can no longer find our line. The final concerning aspect of Pandora is the current. Sometimes it's slow, and sometimes it's fast, and sometimes it's siphoning, and sometimes it's pushing you out, and sometimes it changes during a dive. To give you a concept of this problem, Vince and I have arrived at Pandora with 5 tanks and 2 scooters each for an end-of-line push dive, dropped down into the main cave, and had to immediately abandon the dive because it was siphoning so strong that it would have been unsafe. So in an attempt to study the changing flow patterns, we have installed flow meters in Pandora, and they've been there for about 5 years. These meters can detect water temperature, flow direction, and strength. And the data that we have gathered indicates random large flow events that we've been unable to correlate with rainfall, tides, or season. We have also collected microbial samples from Pandora, which is a lot more difficult than you might think. The DNA analysis did detect a type of microbe known as archaea, which is an ancient extremophile. But it also indicated that archaea is not the main type of microbe found in Pandora, so we're still not sure what this is. And this is just me trying to get a straw into the tube. It is so hard not to touch it. But on that first dive into Pandora, all these adventures were ahead of us, and we had no idea of the enormity of what we had found. So this is the first tiny little line of Pandora that Vince and I laid the very first day. Luckily, we didn't have to wait for very long to find out because our friend and mentor, Steve Bogarts, had agreed to collaborate on the project with us. So the day that we left, we handed him the survey and he headed down and kept going. Luckily, Steve possesses the same tolerance to disgusting environments and discomfort that we do. So with his help, the cave soon grew. And for the next few years, the 3 of us were visiting Pandora as often as possible, sometimes exploring as a team and sometimes independently. And the cave soon became multi-stage, multi-scooter push dives, and Steve started using his rebreather. We didn't have any at that time. So at this point, we had about 5 kilometers of cave from this tiny little entrance, and we were starting to face logistical problems. We needed about 6 tanks and oxygen and 2 scooters each, and still the dives were becoming 5 to 6 hours before deco, and we had to get all this stuff through some pretty tiny places. Furthermore, boat travel was also becoming an issue. We started out renting boats from a local dive shop, but they increased the price and we couldn't afford it anymore. And finally, we had no local support for tank fills. So one time we took 48 tanks between 2 trucks for 4 days of exploration. And it was becoming clear that we needed to find a closer entrance to Pandora that we could start at closer to our ends of line. So we started collaborating with our local contacts and fishermen, and we spent weeks hiking through mangroves, only to discover former cave entrances that had been filled in with dirt from past hurricanes. But we did start finding caves farther north of Pandora. So this is significantly north of Pandora. We named it Vulcan, and it indicated that at least there were more caves in the region. It smelled, if anything, worse than Pandora, and the water was a neon yellow from the sargassum seaweed that was washing in from the ocean. I don't have a photo of the sargassum in the lagoon at Vulcan, but this is what sargassum looks like when it washes ashore. On the beach, sargassum is rotting and it creates a toxic environment which kills fish. And birds eat those fish and they also become ill and die. And of course, everything in nature is connected. So that toxic water from the rotting sargassum is starting to contaminate our coastal aquifer, like the lagoon at Vulcan. Vulcan's floor was covered in these mushy balls of microbial gook, and there was strong reversing flow. And in the brief moments with visibility, we could see microbes that looked like lettuce, but we soon hit a wall. And so for years, we kept looking for more cave entrances, but most landowners did not want us on their ranches. They couldn't believe that we just wanted to go cave diving and thought we needed to have some ulterior motive. And you can't just go hiking around in the jungle in this area looking for caves. It's not very efficient, and it's also illegal because it's trespassing. As well, it's dangerous. You don't want to stumble upon someone's illicit cocaine distribution center, which definitely exists, and you don't want to find a deserted landing strip. So finally, we were introduced to this guy. His name is Jesus, and he manages a ranch that had a cave that we were actually allowed to see. However, it still wasn't anywhere near Pandora. The ranch was even further north of Vulcan, so it was exciting to see the distribution of caves spread in the area. This cave our team named Dagobah. It's not playing. Whoop, let's go back. Here you go. This cave our team named Dagobah after the home planet of the character Yoda, and the entrance required the removal of both tanks. The water was still filled with hydrogen sulfide, and there was also microbial life, but it looked a little bit different. So this microbial life we started calling fuzzies. And we surveyed about 1.6 kilometers of cave passageway on our first trip to Dagobah. But our ultimate goal was still to find another entrance into Pandora. And so finally, the local network of contacts we'd been developing over the last 4 years finally thought they had an idea. It was a cave that was once used as a municipal water supply, but that meant it was on dry land and we didn't have to take a boat. But there was one problem, which was that it was accessed through this landing strip on a marine base. So access sounded impossible. But our friends knew who to talk to, and so we eventually ended up talking to the Marines and convincing them that this would be an interesting project, and they became quite enthusiastic as the project progressed. And this is me and Vince standing on the deserted landing strip, pretending to be airplanes. And it just got better and better. The entrance was once a municipal water supply, which meant that there was a road going right to it. And the Marines let us recut the road so we could back our caves right up to the cave entrance. You cave divers out there know this never happens. We named the cave Melmac after the home planet of the character Alf. And the access to Melmac was just totally bizarre. We're going to go back. There we go. The access to Melmac was totally bizarre. It was through the cement covering of the old pump station. And underneath, there was an artificial cave filled with bats. After a few days of exploration, we had put about 700 meters of line into Melmac, and it looked like it was going to line right up with Pandora. Are we playing? Oop, back. No. There we go. And it looked like it was going to line right up with Pandora. So this is the map of the two. We had only about 500 meters of line between the two places. And so Vince and I made the connection on our next exploration trip. This is a clip from the expedition video I made of the Pandora-Melmac connection. And what's going to be really interesting to see is that on the second day, it looks like the caves are connected, but we actually missed the connection to Pandora by about 2 meters, 3 meters. The line was right in front of us in the tunnel, but the visibility was so bad that we didn't see it, and we had to do a whole other dive to make the connection. So you're gonna see it right now. Yeah, we didn't connect it. We went home and we looked at the survey and we couldn't believe it. So that third day of the dive into Melmac, I would consider the second most satisfying dive of my entire life. There's the connection. And here's original GoPro footage of Vince actually connecting the two lines and placing 2 arrows towards Pandora and 2 arrows towards Melmac, indicating that this is now a cave system and there are 2 entrances. So we accomplished all of this, and then the Marines started denying us access to the military base after we had all of these going leads because it was becoming active. So we were back to square one. I'd become low-key obsessed with Google Earth, and so I started staring at it every night and making sure that I was trying to predict where I would find freshwater outlets. And I highlighted these GPS points. And so we went further into the bay and started looking to check out these freshwater outlets. And we found deep sinkholes plunging into the bay without cave passageways, but interesting in their own right. And soon we found neon green water, and we found hydrogen sulfide clouds once again. So we were not finding caves, but we were finding tiny freshwater outlets, which meant that my hypothesis was not entirely incorrect. And while my main goal was to find more cave entrances in the bay, we did get a few other leads a little bit farther north that we checked out. One of the new places we found was in this lagoon over 100 kilometers north of Dagoba, or of Pandora. The first cave entrance is right next to the road, and Vince is standing right above it. And we named this cave Juno, and it was a total mess. There was a sunken fishing skiff in the entrance, and the strong flow was pulling dying fish corpses into the cave. The color is red because it is stained with the tannins from mangrove roots. We even found a wheelbarrow about 200 meters back in the cave that had been sucked in by the strong flow. As the cave became tighter and the flow became stronger, we totally bailed. We got out of there as fast as possible, and while there may be cave left to explore in Juno, it's not going to be explored by us. But there was another potential entrance across the lagoon. After diving in Juno, we weren't particularly excited to see it, but we went over there. And to get to this cave, we traveled in a small little skiff, and we had to sit on top of our tanks. And as the project continued, we ended up loading 12 tanks and 4 scooters into this tiny little thing, and all my camera gear. The captain had to pull us through the mangroves, but then we found ourselves in this vast lagoon. Like Pandora, the entrance was right on the edge of the mangrove forest, and we named it Ursus. And the water was murky with hydrogen sulfide, but we could see a drop-off. And the first dive into Ursus was interesting. It was really silty and really tight, and we had to tie our line onto the ceiling because there was nothing else to tie off onto. But then at 25 meters, right before we were about to turn around, we popped out into this huge saltwater tunnel. And it was perfectly clear, and there was microbial life and even microbial straws, just like Pandora. It turns out that Ursus is diveable only about 25% of the time. And we've spent plenty of trips down there, going all the way over there, and just to find that it was undiveable. So we have a lot left to do there. So at this point, we'd been working in the area for about 5 years, and I had all of these freshwater outlets I wanted to check, and I finally found a captain who knew how to actually get to one of them. So in late 2019, right before the pandemic struck, Vince and I finally went out to see one of these places. And this is where I finally proved my hypothesis of cave distribution and found a new cave system based entirely on my hypothesis and the points I'd pinpointed on Google Earth. I don't have any video or photos of my first series of dives into this cave, which I named Medusa, because the conditions were simply too extreme. The first dive into Medusa, Vince and I could smell hydrogen sulfide floating on the surface of the water, and so we expected it to be a microbial cave. And we sank down and pulled ourselves through this really narrow slat in the cave, and we popped out into a place that had just seashells, a tiny chamber, but with no microbial life. I breathed out, and the visibility went to 0. And so I felt my way forward until I felt a jet of water push me against the ceiling. And as we all know, in cave diving, you want to follow the flow. So I made a 0 visibility, head down dive into this tiny hole and found myself in a second chamber, which was coated in orange sponges. And I breathed out, and the visibility went to 0 again. And so I pulled myself forward on these orange sponges through this tight passageway. Time slowed down. Oop, go back. Time slowed down, and I started to try to memorize my movements. So like 1 kick with my right foot, 2 kicks forward, turn left. I did this for about 10 minutes until I felt Vince pull my fin, indicating that he wanted to leave. And so I let go of the orange sponges and I just drifted out, navigating just based on my memory of the cave. On the surface, we discussed the dive, and Vince thought it was too dangerous. He didn't want to go back in, but he hadn't been able to see, and I had. So I wanted to go, and we decided I'd go by myself without Vince behind me to block me. And I went back in, and I kept going, and the cave got a little wider, and the flow slowed down, and it was filled with soft microbial dust and tiny stalagmites rising from the floor, and it was beautiful. And then I felt my line behind me go slack. If you know about cave diving, you know that that line is your way to get out of a cave. With visibility, you stand a chance if the line disappears. But without visibility, which I knew I had, I would have no chance. So I froze and I grabbed the ceiling for a reference. And I sat there and I realized that my pulse was racing and I could feel my head throbbing and my hands were numb. And I knew that this is how people die in caves. So I sat there trying to calm myself and just breathed for about 3 minutes until I could feel my hands again and my pulse had slowed. And then I very, very carefully wound up my line until I found a solid tie-off point. I tied it off in 0 visibility and I floated out. So this would probably have been a good place to stop, but I figured that I hadn't gone through all of that for nothing. So I switched my tanks out for Vince's full tanks on the boat, and I went back for one more dive. I swam just a little bit farther forward, and then I thought I hit a wall. But I could see this tiny crack between the wall and the sediment floor. And then I did something I never thought I would do. I took a mental snapshot so I would understand where I was, and I started to dig. The sediment felt like soft, fluffy jello in my hand, and I was soon up to my nose in goo, but it was light enough that it wasn't preventing my regulator from working. So I scooched forward through this goo until I hit a wall with my right tank. And then I backed up, and I removed my right tank, and I held it in front of me, and I swam forward again. And then I hit a wall with my left tank. So I pulled some line off of my exploration reel and tossed that as far into the place in front of me as I could, removed my left tank, and holding them both in front of me like a snowplow, I just pushed my way through this goo in this tiny hole, and I popped out into a big, dark, perfectly clear chamber. And I looked below me, and there was a 20-meter pit just dropping down, and my exploration reel was sitting just on the edge of the pit. And I knew that I had found the main cave passageway. I could see below that there were microbial straws hanging from the ceiling, just like in Pandora. And these are the first images I've ever shown anybody of the main tunnel in Medusa. That's my exploration partner, Vince. And you can see that there's the same microbial life and the same weird snotites, we call them like snot tites. And there's hydrogen sulfide, just like Pandora. And there's the webbies, once again. So this is part of a major cave system, I think, now. Interestingly, in Medusa, we hit salt water at about 20 meters. So there's freshwater, more shallow, and saltwater deeper, and this forms an interface called the halocline. And the density of the microbial gut is such that it'll hang just at the halocline like that, suspended for like days. So we're calling this thing like the Medusa. So I know that due to the toxic conditions and guaranteed zero visibility, the restricted access and the extreme reversing flow, that these caves will never be suitable for recreational cave diving and should never be commercialized. It would be negligent. So there's no money to be made here. There's no profit. This is purely a work of passion. And Vince and I have been spending the last 7 years working down here, and we've explored over 18 kilometers of cave passageway up to this point. And I'm convinced that this will be our life's work and our legacy. Coming back from that first dive in Pandora, I was super excited. I ran home and I told my husband that I was right. My hypothesis of all these years was correct, and I had found the way to find the caves. They were right where they were supposed to be. And he looked at me and he said, Natalie, congratulations. You found the most disgusting caves on the planet. And he's right, but I couldn't think of anything better. Thank you very much.